For 12 hours. December 19th, 1944. Western Front. Somewhere inside a frozen stretch of Ardennes woodland where the trees leaned like wounded soldiers. The world was quiet, but not the silence of peace. The silence that comes just before something breaks. The snow muffled everything. Distant artillery, the crunch of boots, even the faint groan of wind threading through the branches. What remained was the sound of breath, cold, sharp, painful, coming from a single figure hunched behind a fallen pine. Sergeant Daniel Harlowe rubbed the frost from the charging handle of his Browning M1919. Metal hissed under his gloves, eager, unforgiving. His heartbeat thudded against the rhythm of the forest. Steam rose from his scarf every time he exhaled, drifting upward like small ghosts escaping into the air. He didn't dare move yet. Ahead of him, the narrow pass, a frozen corridor of churned snow, broken limbs and craters, stretched like a throat waiting to be crushed. If the enemy punched through here, the 112th Infantry Battalion, still repositioning a kilometer behind him, would be caught blind. Surrounded, and then the line would shatter. He could already imagine the consequences. German panzers sliding through the gap, infantry flooding like a black tide, artillery pounding the U.S. positions from behind. A whole battalion ripped apart before they even knew what hit them, which was why retreat was not an option. Not for him. Not now. His platoon had pulled back 15 minutes earlier. Stumbling through the snow, wounded men leaning on uninjured ones, eyes wide and defeated. Their lieutenant had shouted the order twice, maybe 3 times, his voice cracking like a teenager's. No one argued. They were outnumbered, half-frozen, and dangerously low on ammunition. But Harlowe had stayed. No speech, no drama. He had simply looked at the pass, and then at the terrified young soldiers who depended on someone, anyone, to buy them time. And he said quietly, "I'll hold it." The lieutenant tried to drag him back. Harlowe didn't budge. Now he was alone. One sergeant, one machine gun, one belt of ammunition draped like a serpent across his chest, 3 grenades tucked into the deep pockets of his coat, a trench knife strapped to his thigh, and the cold, the kind that worked its way into the bones and whispered reminders of mortality. His boots were buried to the ankles in snow, his fingertips numb, his breath turning into frost on his collar. Every sound seemed magnified. The soft settling of ice on branches, the distant clank of metal from somewhere far down the pass. He listened. There it was again. Metal. Movement. Boots. The Germans were coming. Not scouts. Not a probing patrol. No. This sounded heavier, more organized. Dozens of footsteps pressing through the forest, coordinated, confident. The crunch of snow under synchronized marching. Voices, faint, disciplined, speaking quick bursts of German. A full company. At least 100 men. Harlowe tightened his grip on the Browning. His fingers, despite the cold, moved with the familiarity of routine. Flipping open the cover, checking the feed, adjusting the bipod, sweeping the barrel across a small arc between 2 shattered spruce trees. He set his jaw. The forest seemed to hold its breath with him. Out in the swirling gray haze, figures began to emerge. Dark shapes first, then helmets, then rifles slung across shoulders. Their winter camouflage cloaks fluttered in the freezing wind like pale wings. They weren't rushing. They were expecting nothing. No resistance. No threat. Arrogance, he thought. And that gave him an edge. He waited until the first squad stepped fully into the pass. 12 men, maybe 14. Their officer walked near the center, pointing ahead, his voice crisp, disappointed even. The German troops scanned the path lazily, rifles low, posture relaxed. They had no idea what waited for them. Harlowe inhaled, feeling the cold tear at his lungs. His finger curled onto the trigger. His heartbeat slowed. A strange calm taking over, narrowing the world until it was just him his weapon, and the enemy. A single thought crossed his mind. If I fire too early, I die. If I fire too late, everyone else dies. He chose the moment between heartbeats. The Browning roared. Muzzle flashes lit up the trees like lightning trapped inside a tunnel. Snow blasted upward in clouds, broken by the violent impact of .30 caliber rounds ripping through it. The forest shook with the sudden explosion of sound. The lead German soldier folded instantly, collapsing backward into the man behind him. The officer dove into the snow, screaming commands that shattered the illusion of order. Bullets stitched through the line, cutting torsos, shattering helmets, kicking up geysers of white frost. The patrol panicked. Some dove behind trees, some fell flat, some tried to run. But the pass was too narrow, too exposed. The Browning's suppressive fire pinned them down like insects under glass. Harlowe's hands moved fast, feeding the belt, tapping the charging handle, shifting his aim inches at a time. He wasn't just firing. He was sculpting the battlefield, shaping where the enemy could move and where they couldn't. A grenade arced from a German hand. Too short. It landed in the snow, 30 meters away, erupting in a muffled boom that shook loose snow from branches above him. Harlowe didn't flinch. He pivoted, pouring fire into a cluster of soldiers scrambling for the right side tree line. Rounds hit, bodies jerked, snow turned dark. The officer tried to regroup the survivors, yelling for his machine gun team. Harlowe spotted them. A pair of Germans rushing forward with an MG-34, trying to wedge it behind a fallen tree. He redirected fire instantly. The MG crew didn't make it, but more shadows moved in the haze behind them. More than before. The next wave, a full company advancing, now alerted, now angry, now spreading out into attack formations. Harlowe felt the Browning's barrel growing hotter, steam rising as snowflakes hit the metal. He swapped position, dragging the gun 3 meters left behind a blown-apart stump, kicking fresh snow over the old firing spot to hide the trail. Bullets snapped past him. The first retaliation. The fight was about to change. The Germans were no longer strolling into an ambush. They were hunting him. And they had numbers, grenades, machine guns, and momentum. Harlowe had one gun, one heartbeat, and a single promise he could not break. He wiped frost from his eyebrows, took a breath that burned like fire in the cold air, and braced himself for the storm. Because the real assault was only just beginning. For 29 hours. The pass was no longer quiet. It pulsed with movement. Boots hammering through snow, shouted German commands echoing through the trees, rifle bolts clacking as the enemy reorganized. Sergeant Harlowe dragged the Browning into its new position behind the shattered stump, snow grinding under the bipod legs. His gloves were stiff with frost, his fingertips numb, but his motions remained precise, practiced, almost ritualistic. He risked a 1-second glance over the top of the stump. They were coming hard now. The Germans had fanned out into 3 staggered elements, an unmistakable attack pattern. 2 assault squads moved along the tree line on either side of the pass, while a third pushed directly up the center, supported by riflemen providing covering fire. Their discipline was clear. Crouched silhouettes advancing in short bursts, weapons up, eyes sharp. This was no longer the easy advance of a company expecting no resistance. This was a company preparing to crush a single holdout. Harlowe exhaled slowly, a thin plume of frost drifting in the air like smoke from a dying fire. His breath tasted like blood and metal and cold. He settled the Browning into the crook of his shoulder, braced his elbows in the snow, and waited for the enemy to cross the threshold he'd chosen. He whispered to the forest, as if reminding it, "You're not falling today." Then he fired. The Browning thundered again, its recoil slamming into his shoulder, its barrel flashing like a beacon of defiance in the dim morning light. Brass casings spat out in a glittering arc, disappearing into the snow with soft hisses. The first German squad took the brunt of it. Harlowe's rounds chewed through branches, bark, and bodies, ripping apart their cover. A soldier tumbled into a drift, his rifle flying from his hands. Another collapsed sideways, arms flung outward, as if caught in mid-stride. Still the rest pushed forward. They were veterans. He could see it in their movements, the way they kept low, the way they darted between cover, the way they fired in disciplined bursts rather than panic sprays. The forest became a storm of splintered wood and whipping powder. Bullets snapped overhead, slicing branches and sending pine needles raining down. One round struck the stump inches from Harlowe's face, kicking up a spray of frozen bark. He didn't blink. He shifted fire to the right flank, where another squad crawled on bellies through the softened snow, trying to reach a log that would give them elevation. He lit up the area with a sweeping burst. The snow erupted like boiling water. Bodies jerked. One soldier rolled aside, clutching his thigh, screaming for a medic. The rest scattered, diving behind trees in chaotic disarray. But the Germans were learning. They were probing, testing his range and rhythm. A whistle shrilled. Harlowe's eyes darted left. Too late. A German rifle squad had reached a cluster of boulders only 20 meters away. Close enough to lob grenades. Close enough to flank him. He turned the Browning toward them. But the belt was nearly finished. A curse stuck in his throat. He grabbed the next belt, slapping it into the feed tray with clumsy, frozen fingers. The metallic snap echoed louder in his ears than the gunfire around him. A grenade arched toward his position. He dove flat. The explosion threw snow into the air with a deafening crack. The shockwave punched into his side, rolling him halfway down a shallow dip between two trees. His ears rang, sharp and painful, like needles driven into his skull. He scrambled to his knees, dragging the Browning with him. The Germans surged forward, thinking he was hit. 3 of them broke cover, charging toward him with rifles raised and bayonets fixed. Their boots crashed through the snow, breath steaming in the cold. Harlowe didn't try to remount the Browning. He swung it from the hip. The burst was wild, but not wasted. The first attacker dropped instantly. The second stumbled as rounds tore through the snow at his feet, then into his torso. The third lunged to the side, firing blindly, bullets cracking past Harlowe's shoulder. Harlowe yanked the Browning's barrel toward him like a shield and rolled behind a half-buried fallen tree. Snow soaked into his coat. His heart hammered. His lungs burned. Too close, he thought. He needed a new position. Higher ground, better cover. Something that would keep the Germans guessing. He spotted a jagged outcrop of rock 10 meters upslope. But between him and that outcrop, open snowfield. A killing zone. He listened. Gunfire shifted direction, German voices closing in. They were trying to flank right again. The left side was still compromised from earlier fire. The center was tightening. If he stayed here, they'd overrun him within minutes. If he moved, he had seconds at best. He slung the Browning across his shoulder, grabbed his remaining grenades, and forced his frozen legs into motion. The cold stabbed his thighs with each step, but he powered through, breath ragged and visible in frantic bursts. The Germans spotted him. Shouts erupted. Rifles snapped toward him. He dove forward, landing hard in the snow, rolling behind a cluster of saplings as rounds tore into the drift he'd just vacated. He felt the icy sting of snow packing into his collar, sliding down his neck. He crawled, elbows sinking into the powder, dragging the Browning with him like a wounded companion. Every movement felt slower than the last, his body fighting both exhaustion and cold. A burst of MG-42 fire ripped across the pass. The enemy's machine gun had finally gotten into position. The high-velocity rounds sawed through the trees, sending shards of wood spraying like shrapnel. He flattened himself as the torrent raked the slope. Snow exploded all around him. A branch whipped across his cheek, slicing skin. Warm blood trickled down his jaw, instantly cooling into a thin red ribbon. He didn't stop. He reached the outcrop, a jagged shield of stone jutting from the hillside. He dragged the Browning into place, breath heaving, body shaking. From behind the rock, he had a view of the pass again, and what he saw froze him more than the winter air ever could. The Germans weren't retreating. They were assembling. At least 50 men formed up in the treeline, ready for a coordinated charge. Their MG crews flanked left and right. Their riflemen crouched in staggered waves. Their officers stood behind them, silhouettes rigid in the bleak half-light. They were preparing to crush the lone defender with overwhelming force. One man against a company, one gun against dozens, and the forest, which had felt like an ally moments earlier, now felt like a cage tightening around him. Harlowe wiped blood from his chin and steadied the Browning against the rock. His heartbeat slowed again, becoming that dangerous, familiar calm. The kind that came when there was nowhere left to run and nothing left to rely on except determination. He muttered to himself, voice rough but unwavering, "Come on, then." A whistle blew. The German line surged forward, and Harlowe squeezed the trigger. The Browning roared, the charge thundered, and the forest descended into chaos. 4:41 hours. The forest no longer whispered, it screamed. The charging German company tore through the snow, rifles raised, boots hammering in violent unison. White powder blasted upward with every step, turning the pass into a churning sea of cold fog and shadows. Their bayonets glinted like shards of moonlight. Their breath spilled in clouds that made them look like an advancing line of war-born specters. From behind the jagged outcrop, Sergeant Harlowe braced the Browning and leaned into the recoil as the gun unleashed a devastating curtain of fire. His rounds streaked through the charging formation, punching into winter coats, tearing through helmets, carving dark shapes out of the white. Men collapsed mid-stride, their bodies skidding across the snow. Others dove sideways, thrown into chaos by the sudden, violent interruption of their assault. But they didn't stop. They shifted, adjusted, re-angled. Trained soldiers responding to a threat with precision, like a wave hitting a boulder. The line flowed around its losses and surged forward again. Harlowe saw it all in flashes. A corporal in a white field smock yelling his men onward. 2 MG-42 crews splitting to opposite flanks, their silhouettes sharp and hungry for angles. Grenadiers breaking off toward the left knoll, using the terrain to close the distance. They weren't blind anymore. They knew where he was, and they were going to crush him through sheer numbers. Harlowe ground his teeth, tightening his grip. Snowflakes hissed as they touched the Browning's burning barrel. Steam rose from the gun like it was breathing. The belt rattled. Brass casings clinked against the rock. The trigger hammered beneath his glove. But the Germans were adapting. They learned his rhythm. 2-second bursts, 5-second resets. They counted the time between belt feeds. They listened for the moments when the Browning sputtered, when the barrel climbed too hot, when the recoil changed tone. And they moved. Fast. Harlowe cut down a rifleman vaulting over a fallen log. Another collapsed while sprinting between trees. A third tumbled into the snow as he tried to throw a grenade. But still they kept coming, a relentless tide of winter-gray bodies pressing through smoke, frost, and the metallic smell of blood. The Browning's bolt slammed forward on an empty chamber. Dry click. "Come on," Harlowe hissed under his breath. He slapped in the next belt, but his fingers were barely responding now. They felt like wood, stiff and trembling from the cold. Twice the belt slipped. Once it fell into the snow. He grabbed it, shaking powder from the cartridges with frantic jerks. A German squad broke from the main force and sprinted up slope toward his rock. 6 men, 10 meters away, closing fast. He didn't have time to remount the gun. Harlowe grabbed one of his last grenades. pulled the pin with his teeth, lobbed it over the rock. The explosion shattered the slope. Snow and earth flew upward in a violent blast. 2 Germans were thrown backward, limbs twisting unnaturally. A third crumpled face first. The others hit the ground and crawled behind a dead tree trunk, firing blindly. Rounds chewed through the upper edge of the rock, spraying grit and splinters into Harlowe's face. One bullet sliced through his sleeve, grazing skin. Warm blood trickled down his forearm, steaming as it met the freezing air. He sucked in a sharp breath, ripped the Browning into position, and slammed the charging handle. It roared back to life. He swept the slope, bullets pulverizing the tree trunk where the surviving Germans hid. Wood exploded into fragments. One soldier rolled downhill, clutching his chest. Another tried to retreat. Harlowe cut him down before he made 2 steps. But the main force was now dangerously close. 20 meters. 15. Some had reached the low mounds near the pass, firing up at his position. Others slipped behind fractured tree lines, flanking again. The MG-42 crews had settled into suppressing positions, their barrel flashes flickering like strobe lights in the gloom. The rattling thunder of the MG-42 filled the air. Unmistakable, vicious, terrifying. Its fire raked across the ridge, closer with each sweep. Chips of stone bit into Harlowe's cheeks. The rock trembled under the impact of rounds punching into it. He ducked low, feeling the gunfire pass above him in a brutal stream. The forest sounded like it was tearing apart. He waited, listened, counted. The German machine gunner shifted his angle. Harlowe rose, fired. A burst tore through the MG-42 nest. The first gunner slumped instantly. The assistant gunner tried to drag the weapon behind a root cluster. A second burst stopped him before he made it halfway. But taking out one machine gun didn't change the tide. The second MG-42 was already repositioning. Dozens of riflemen closed in, and the ammunition belt feeding Harlowe's Browning was shrinking fast. He checked it. Barely a few dozen rounds left. He had 1 grenade remaining, and the forest was filled with enemy shapes closing from every direction. A round struck the rock, ricocheting past his ear with a screaming metallic whine. He didn't flinch, but he felt the heat of it as it grazed his neck, slicing through scarf and skin. Blood welled along the cut, warm for a moment before freezing. Another burst from the German rifles forced him low again. The pass was no longer a battlefield. It was a drowning pit, and he was the lone survivor fighting to keep his head above the tide. He blinked sweat and blood from his eyes and forced himself upright. Pain knifed through his shoulder, his back, his legs. He ignored it all. He dragged the Browning to the very edge of the rock, barrel dipping into the void below. If they wanted to climb to him, they'd have to step into the kill zone. He braced the gun, gritted his teeth, waited. The Germans appeared through the haze, 5, 8, 12, maybe more. Shadows in white camouflage, rising like phantoms out of the drifting snow. They saw him. They shouted. They charged. Harlowe fired the last of his belt into them. The gun bucked wildly. Snow exploded. Bodies fell. Screams tore into the cold air. The belt ran dry. Click, click. Silence. The Germans were still coming. Close now. Too close. Harlowe's hands shook as he reached for his final grenade. He pulled it free. Pin ready. Boots thundered up the slope. 1 second. 2. 3. He had no more machine gun. No more cover. No time. Only one move left. He pulled the pin. And then, 4:53 hours. The forest seemed to shrink around Sergeant Harlowe, the trees leaning closer as if bearing witness to his defiance. Snow clung to his coat, frozen fingers numb to the point of barely being able to grasp his Browning or his last grenade. The icy air burned his lungs with every breath. The distant artillery had faded into a muffled rumble. leaving only the crunch of boots and the whistle of approaching bullets. The German company had closed in. 15 meters now. The snow beneath their boots churned into icy sludge. Their rifles cracked intermittently, the sharp reports snapping against the jagged trunks. Harlowe's heart pounded like a drum in his chest, each beat matching the rhythm of the enemy's advance. He leaned over the rock, tightened his grip on the grenade, and felt the cold metal of the pin press against his teeth. The weapon was his last argument, his final punctuation. He glimpsed the faces of the enemy soldiers. Young, hungry, confident. They had no idea he was ready to turn the pass into a death trap. A soldier raised his rifle to fire, stepping into the open. The perfect target. Harlowe flung the grenade with a flick of his wrist. Time seemed to stretch as it spun through the icy air. A deadly arc traced by fate itself. It landed in the center of the approaching squad, and the explosion tore through the trees, snow, and flesh alike. A plume of white smoke rose, mixing with the cold morning haze. Screams followed, sharp and terrible, echoing through the frozen woods. He slumped against the rock, breathing hard, counting the seconds between each echo of destruction. But he knew the company was not broken yet. They would reform. They always did. The rest of the line was already moving, flanking, adjusting, adapting to the chaos he had wrought. Harlowe dragged the Browning into a new firing position, repositioning behind a cluster of broken trees and frozen roots. His fingers were blue and cracked, but his training never faltered. The machine gun roared again, swallowing the advancing Germans in fire and snow. The pass became a tableau of violent chaos. Bodies, smoke, and splintered wood intertwined in a deadly dance. The enemy tried to coordinate, pushing from multiple angles. Rifle fire whined past his ears, ricocheting off trees. A bullet struck a nearby trunk, sending splinters into his face. Blood mingled with snow and sweat, freezing almost instantly. Harlowe adjusted his aim, firing into the densest pockets of attackers. The cold barrel shook in his hands. Minutes passed like hours. Every movement Harlowe made had to be precise. He ducked, rolled, repositioned, and fired with unrelenting intensity. His energy drained, every muscle screaming against the cold and fatigue. Yet he could not stop. Not now. Not ever. Behind him, the battalion's fate hung in the balance, a fragile line he had sworn to protect. The Germans advanced relentlessly. MG-42 crews recalculated their positions, seeking to sweep the snowfields he used for cover. They fired in short bursts, attempting to suppress him, forcing him to stay low, to conserve ammunition. But Harlowe's Browning was his voice, his declaration, his defiance. He poured fire into the flanks of every squad, his eyes scanning constantly for the next movement, the next target. He was exhausted. No, bloodied, alone. And yet, in the storm of bullets, grenades, and splintered trees he held, every second became a strategy, every breath a decision. Shoot, move, reload, survive, kill, repeat. The Germans realized brute force was not enough. They began sending grenadiers into the underbrush, creeping along flanks, attempting to climb the slope unseen. Harlowe anticipated them, throwing his last grenade into their midst. The blast sent a shockwave of snow, ice, and screams cascading down the hill. Several men fell, others retreated, re-evaluating the lone figure who refused to die. Moments of stillness stretched between the bursts of fire, eerie and tense. Harlowe allowed himself a quick glance behind. The battalion was still repositioning, their movements slowed but unbroken. He had done what he had promised, bought them time. And yet, the cost was clear. His uniform was shredded, his hands raw, his body aching from the cold and exertion. Then came the sound he had been waiting for, distant, almost imperceptible at first, the telltale crunch of approaching boots not in formation, not German but American. Reinforcements. Relief. But the Germans had not yet noticed the shift. Harlowe fired a final controlled burst, picking off 2 soldiers who had crept too close. His machine gun rattled with the last of the feed belt, metal snapping against the icy air. And then, silence. A brief lull, punctuated only by moans and the soft fall of snow disturbed by bodies. He slumped forward against the rock, trying to gather his strength, trying to breathe, trying to process that he had survived, that he was still standing, still holding the line. The forest seemed to exhale with him. The cold momentarily softened, the snow no longer screaming beneath German boots. But he knew better than to let his guard down. Not yet. Not while enemies still lingered in the trees. Not while the pass could still be claimed by force. The battle had not ended, only paused. Harlowe lifted his Browning, scanning the pass. Smoke drifted between shattered trees. Shadows of German soldiers huddled behind debris, regrouping, nursing injuries. Their faces betrayed disbelief, fury, and fear. The sergeant realized the effect he had had. One man, one position, had turned chaos into survival for an entire battalion. Yet the moment of reckoning remained. The next wave would come, and the forest would once again demand blood, courage, and defiance. He gritted his teeth, adjusting the Browning, and muttered under his breath, "This line doesn't fall." The frozen woods waited, and so did the enemy. 12 hours. The first light of dawn bled weakly through the skeletal trees, painting the snow in a muted gray. The forest was a battlefield still echoing with the staccato rhythm of gunfire, the moans of the wounded, and the scent of blood and cold iron. Sergeant Harlowe crouched behind his jagged rock outcrop, muscles screaming, lungs burning, body frozen in exhaustion yet taut with alertness. The German company had paused, regrouping after the fury of his machine gun and grenades. But Harlowe knew better than to trust this temporary lull. Experienced soldiers never surrendered. They were calculating, counting, observing, hunting for weakness. He scanned the pass through frost-bitten lashes. His uniform was shredded. His gloves were torn. Fingers stiff, numb beyond recognition, still managed to cycle the Browning. His ammunition was nearly spent, grenades gone. Yet the sergeant's eyes burned with fierce determination. He had become a single, relentless instrument of defense, the forest itself a shield and weapon in his hands. Movement flickered through the haze. He spotted a small flanking element. 6 soldiers using a broken tree line to approach unseen. Harlowe lifted the Browning, aiming carefully. Snapshots echoed into the forest. 2 soldiers fell immediately. One froze in the snow, clutching his shoulder, screaming. The others ducked behind cover, exchanging panicked glances. A sudden crack of wood near his position made him pivot sharply. A German soldier had attempted to climb the slope, using a fallen branch for cover. Harlowe fired instinctively. The recoil threw him off balance, snow spraying like frozen shrapnel. The soldier crumpled silently into the white. Harlowe's breathing was ragged. His heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his jaw. Every fiber of his body screamed for rest. But he couldn't. Not with the battalion behind him, not with the pass still at stake. He shifted position slightly, dragging the Browning along the frozen earth. The snow beneath him was spattered with dark crimson, mixing with the white in a grotesque mosaic. Shadows moved again, Germans attempting to regroup, seeking a better angle, unaware of how intimately he knew this terrain. Harlowe's eyes narrowed. He remembered every stump, every fallen tree, every depression in the snow. Each was a trap, a firing lane, a weapon if used correctly. One by one, he began funneling the attackers, shooting with surgical precision, forcing them into channels of his design. Snow and blood erupted as rounds struck. Panic spread through their ranks. Time became elastic. Minutes stretched into eternity. The sergeant shifted, fired, reloaded, threw, ducked, and rolled, his every movement choreographed in a deadly rhythm. His mind had become a battlefield as much as the pass itself. Strategy, instinct, and pure survival converged in a storm of calculated violence. Then, through the haze of smoke and snow, he heard it, boots louder, closer, and unmistakable. Reinforcements. The sound of disciplined American soldiers moving with purpose, breaking through the fog of battle. A surge of hope flared in his chest. Yet he kept firing, keeping the Germans pinned long enough for his comrades to reach him. The Germans realized their advantage slipping. Their flanking squads began to withdraw, trying to avoid the incoming reinforcements. Harlowe focused fire on the most exposed, cutting them down with brutal efficiency. One after another, the enemy faltered, stumbled, or fell. He could see the effect. The tide that had threatened to engulf him was receding, bloodied and disoriented. A sharp whistle cut through the air. The Germans panicked. Orders shouted in German fell on ears already ringing from explosions and gunfire. Harlowe's Browning barked again, hammering the final handful of rounds into their retreating forms. The forest trembled with the echoes of this last furious stand. Exhaustion crashed over him like a tidal wave. He slumped back against the rock, breathing heavily, blood freezing on his skin. The snow around him was scarred with footprints, craters, and the scattered forms of the dead and dying. He had held the pass, against impossible odds. Alone! The sound of approaching voices grew clearer. His reinforcements were almost there. Relief was palpable, but he stayed focused, scanning for any last threats. Every snap of a twig or shift of shadow could be a German soldier trying to hide. A final attempt to reclaim the pass. When the first U.S. soldier finally stepped over the ridge, eyes wide at the carnage, Harlowe didn't smile. He slumped forward slightly, exhaustion overtaking the tension that had driven him for the past hour. He nodded, a gesture both weary and defiant, acknowledging the arrival of help without letting the enemy sense vulnerability. From behind him, more Americans poured into the pass. They quickly assessed the scene. Dozens of German soldiers down, wounded or fleeing. Their machine guns and rifles clattered into position, securing the pass. Harlowe finally allowed himself to breathe, to lean fully against the rock, his hands trembling. An officer approached cautiously, scanning the remaining battlefield. When he realized who held the line, his expression shifted from shock to awe. Harlowe had done what no one expected. He had defied orders, ignored the retreat, and single-handedly bought the battalion time, transforming a narrow forest corridor into a gauntlet of death for the enemy. Snow fell silently over the carnage now. The forest seemed to calm, the chaos receding into whispers. Harlowe looked around at the destruction, at the bodies of enemy soldiers frozen in mid-stride, at the torn limbs of shattered trees, and at the white landscape streaked red. He was alive. They were alive. And the line had held. But deep in his chest, he knew the battle was far from over. War never truly paused. The forest had survived this hour, but the larger fight for the Ardennes continued. Harlowe closed his eyes for a brief moment, feeling the weight of what he had endured, and the weight of what was yet to come. Even as reinforcements secured the pass, he knew this story. This one sergeant against a company would live long after the snow melted, a testament to courage, resolve, and defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. The forest held its breath once more, and Sergeant Daniel Harlowe still stood. 6:15 hours. Dawn broke fully across the Ardennes, weak sunlight glinting off the frozen treetops, turning the snow into a blinding white sheet streaked with red and black. The forest, once alive with the chaos of battle, now seemed eerily still, except for the faint groans of wounded soldiers and the occasional crack of ice settling on broken branches. Sergeant Daniel Harlowe leaned against his jagged rock, the Browning resting across his lap, hands shaking, body trembling, yet every sense still alert. The battalion had finally secured the pass. Men moved through the snow with methodical efficiency, tending to the wounded, accounting for the dead, and taking stock of the devastation Harlowe had wrought alone. Their eyes were wide, awe etched on every face as they looked at the lone figure who had defied orders, defied death, and held the line. Harlowe's mind replayed the last hour in fragments. The first roar of the Browning, the flash of rifles, the thud of falling bodies, the hiss of grenades through frozen air, the screams, the snow, the blood. He had moved through it all, aware of every second, every heartbeat, every choice. Alone, yet completely alive, fully present in each terrifying, magnificent moment. The officer who arrived first knelt beside him, eyes scanning the pass. "Sergeant, you've done something incredible here," he said, voice almost trembling. Harlowe's lips tightened, a nod the only acknowledgement. Words weren't needed. The snow spoke for him, littered with the remnants of a company defeated by one man's will. Around him, soldiers helped him to his feet, steadying him, their hands warm against his frozen ones. He took a few steps, each motion laborious, muscles stiff from hours of exertion and cold. Yet in that staggering movement, there was pride. Not for himself, not for glory, but for the battalion he had saved, for the countless lives spared because he had chosen to stay. He glanced across the pass. Bodies of enemy soldiers lay frozen in unnatural poses. Some had tried to flee, some had tried to fight, and some had simply stumbled into the trap he had prepared. Broken rifles jutted from the snow. Shattered trees marked the paths of bullets. Every inch of the pass bore witness to his stand. The battalion's medics worked quickly, tending to the wounded, and for the first time, Harlowe allowed himself a deeper breath. Relief surged through him, mingled with exhaustion so profound it nearly buckled his knees. His chest heaved as the adrenaline faded, leaving the raw ache of the fight behind. Around him, men began to whisper, quietly at first, then louder. "Did you see him? He was alone. All that time. I don't know how he did it. If he hadn't held the pass." Their voices were awed, reverent, almost sacred. Harlowe listened without responding. The story would spread. Of the sergeant who refused to retreat, who stood alone, and who held back an entire German company. But he didn't need the words. The forest itself told the tale. Command arrived shortly after. Officers moving swiftly through the snow, taking notes, shaking hands, nodding with incredulous respect. They asked questions, demanded details, confirmed the accounts. Harlowe recounted the moments. Bursts of gunfire, flanking maneuvers, grenades, MG-42s, the ebb and flow of chaos. Every word precise, unemotional, measured. There was no boast. Only fact. Only survival. Only duty fulfilled. As the morning deepened, he finally allowed himself to sit fully on the snow-covered ground. The weight of hours alone in combat pressed down on him now. A physical and emotional exhaustion unlike any other. His uniform was tattered. His gloves were gone. Frost had bitten through his jacket. Blood was frozen on his skin. Yet despite it all, he felt an unshakable clarity. He had done exactly what he had to do. Nearby, soldiers began clearing the pass, marking the bodies, moving the dead, securing the area. Harlowe observed, silent, distant. The forest had tested him, almost destroyed him, but it had also witnessed something extraordinary. A single human against impossible odds, unyielding, unbroken, and fully alive in the face of fear. A young private approached, hesitating, then handed him a canteen of water. Harlowe accepted it without a word, sipping slowly. The liquid burned through the cold, soothing his parched throat. Around him, the battalion regrouped, their presence a reminder that his stand had not been in vain. Every man alive owed him a debt that could never truly be repaid. Harlowe's eyes scanned the horizon. The forest, still frosted and silent, seemed to bow in quiet reverence. He knew that war would continue, Ardennes, Europe, the world. Yet in this moment, he had carved out a small victory, a testament to human resilience, courage, and the unbreakable spirit of one determined man. Officers began taking notes, soldiers told their accounts, and reporters would later arrive to record the extraordinary stand. But for Harlowe, there was only the snow, the forest, and the enduring realization that one man alone could alter the course of many. He rose slowly, brushing snow from his shoulders. The forest was quiet now, the echoes of gunfire replaced by distant movement, by the low groans of the wounded, and by the soft whisper of wind through bare branches. It was over, and yet the story had only begun. Sergeant Daniel Harlowe would never forget the faces of those he saved. Nor would the battalion ever forget the line that it held because one man refused to retreat. The forest had demanded everything: courage, skill, sacrifice. And in return, it granted survival and a legacy that would endure far beyond the snow, far beyond the Ardennes, far beyond the war. Harlowe turned toward the path of the battalion, joining the men who had once depended on him. Each step was slow, deliberate, and heavy with meaning. He had stood against the storm, and now, as the first rays of winter's sun broke through the trees, he walked forward, alive, scarred, triumphant, and forever remembered. In the silence that followed the chaos, the forest itself seemed to whisper, "This is where courage became legend."